Okay, so today I'm going to speak about autism and neurodiversity. And I suppose to begin is just to give a description of the diagnosis of autism in the DSM-5. So that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And that is very much based within the medical model. So diagnosis is given by a multidisciplinary team, usually based on particular criteria. And for autism, it's persistent deficits in social communication, social interaction across multiple contexts, restricted repetitive patterns of interest or activities. And the latest version of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, acknowledges the differences in sensory processing. So I suppose we'll just move on to the next slide. So the medical model perspective of autism really views autism through the non-autistic lens. So diagnosis in the past has always been based on a view of autism from the outside in. So diagnosis involves observation of behaviors and social interactions and communication in comparison to neurotypical development. And autism is called a spectrum condition because people with autism can present so differently. The process of diagnosis is a multidisciplinary team assessment, as I said, and particular tools can be used to help to support a diagnosis. These include the Autism Diagnostic Interview Schedule, which is a play-based assessment, or it looks at social interaction. So the child or young person will be with a member of the diagnostic team, and particular activities are undertaken to try and elicit particular responses in terms of communication and interaction. And then the ADIR is an interview, usually with parents or guardians, and it's a very, very long, detailed interview looking back at the child's development. Just move on to the next slide, please. So autism is a spectrum condition, and I suppose what people think is that autism looks a bit like this linear version where people are less autistic on one side and more autistic on the other. And really what it is it's more like the wheel on the right side there that you can see. So where people have differences in different areas of their functioning, and people can have what we call a spiky profile. So they may have strengths in one area and then needs in other areas of their functioning. Move on now to the next slide, please. Okay, so neurodiversity then, where does neurodiversity come in relation to autism? So the concept of neurodiversity was first thought of in 1988 by Judy Singer, who was an Australian social scientist who ended up having a diagnosis of autism herself. And the neurodiversity movement looked at autism through the lens of it was a social and political movement. It was the beginning really of autistic people being able to explain themselves what autism is like, and the idea that autism is a neurodivergent brain type really. So just a different type of brain than the neurotypical type of brain. And now in 2017, Simon Baron-Cohen, one of the main researchers in the University of Cambridge, he's a professor of psychology and psychiatry. He has done research that backs up this concept. So the idea that all of human invention and human evolution was possible because of a diversity of brains out there, and that the autistic brain or the neurodivergent brain is just one of those. It's just a type of brain. And things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, DCD, tic disorders all come in under neurodiversity. I suppose this initially for many years was a lot of controversy. I might move on to the next slide, please. There was a lot of controversy about this this idea of neurodiversity, and people worried, was it minimizing the differences or the difficulties? And I suppose we've really come full circle with that now, and even in relation to the language that we use around autism. So you may notice that I'm calling autistic people and not people with autism, and that's a massive shift. Even from the time when I finished my master's in 2016, we would have still been saying a person with autism. And again, within the medical model, that comes from our wish to not define the person the way we would say somebody with diabetes or with epilepsy. We're trying not to define the person by the condition. But I suppose what we've learned from the autistic community themselves and from research now from autistic researchers is that for autism it's different, because autism is part of the person's identity. It's how their brain functions. It's not something that can be separated from the person or that they can carry around with them in a bag. And it is the overwhelmingly wish of the autistic community to use the term autistic rather than person with autism. It's not everybody's wish, and you will meet people who prefer to use the term person with autism. I think it took me a seismic, shift to be able to make myself get used to saying autistic, but I've read enough of the research now to know that it is the right thing to do. And I suppose it comes along with this whole view of neurodiversity. It's very important in terms of diagnosis, and when we come into contact with autistic people, that we are given this message of difference rather than deficit. And that, with autism, even though there are lots and lots of needs and people always have needs, they also have huge strengths, and there are strengths that come with the autistic mind. So if we can frame autism in a very positive way for children and young people, particularly when we're given diagnosis, this is something that protects them into the future in terms of their self-esteem, their view of themselves. And it's really, really important in my practice to me to make sure that I'm given a positive view of autism forward. So there's just a link there to Rebecca Burgess, who's an autistic artist who has lots of comic strip explanations and gives you more detail that you can look into. You can click on the presentation and find them there. And again, this spiky profile on the right, where neurotypical people who are not autistic or don't have any other neurodivergent condition, usually have a very smooth round circle when you look at that line, whereas for the autistic person, their profile is quite spiky. So they may have significant difficulty in one area like the social skills there, but quite, very good perception skills. But every single person is different. And when you've met one autistic person, you've just met one autistic person. I might move to the next slide, please. So then again, that the neurodiversity paradigm really fits into the social or human rights model of disability, whereas the diagnosis of autism and all of us being nurses are usually coming from the medical model side of things. However, when we're talking about autism, we really have to shift over to the social or human rights model. And it is in line with what some of the other speakers have said today around that human rights view of when we're caring for patients. So in the medical model, autism is based on deficits. All of the difficulty lies within the person. The research is based on finding a cause and a cure. And the idea is to fix the person or to fit them into the world. And the language we use is person with autism. So then in the social or human rights model, we look at difference rather than deficit, and disability is a construct of society, which is very easy to understand when we think about physical disability. If a person is a wheelchair user and they come to a building and there's no ramp, then they're suddenly disabled. Whereas if they have access to that building and it's accessible to them, there's no disability there. And similarly with autistic people, if the world was changed and modified to suit their particular needs, then the disability melts away and the person is able to access the world. And this is particularly important when we think about hospitals. I know this cohort, this group of children and young people have massive, huge difficulty with access to healthcare because the system is built for neurotypical people. So the world is set up by neurotypical people for neurotypical people and leads to a disability for neurodiverse individuals. So each person is inherently valued by society within the social human rights model. And then, as I said, the language around autism is the autistic person identity first language rather than person first language, and that's written into the NICE guidelines now as well. I might move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, and this slide again just confirms what I said already. It's just a visual to explain it a bit further, and I'll move on quickly to the next one because I know I have far too many slides for the time allocated. So the bridge between these models, the diagnosis is founded in the medical model, and the clinician, even at the time of diagnosis, can really adapt the values and the language of the social and neurodiversity paradigm, which is really what's happening now in the world of autism. And there was a very recent webinar series with the Psychological Society of Ireland where they put out really step-by-step how clinicians can change their language, even in reports and when they're speaking to children and families, because the children who are getting a report about themselves now will be adults in a few years, will be able to read back what was said about them. So we don't want to minimize the challenges. We don't want to say, oh, you know, it's just a different type of brain, sure, everything's fine here. We really need to access more support because society doesn't offer enough support. So while we change to thinking about differences and a different type of brain, we really do want to emphasize the needs of the person too and what they need, and encourage self-acceptance and pride in who they are, because we know autistic children and young people have a much higher risk of mental health difficulties, particularly in adolescence and in older, when they're older people as well. And this is often related to not being able to access employment, to fit into the world, or have a positive view of themselves. Often people think there's just something wrong with them. And that has really been perpetuated by the medical model to now in relation to autism. So in hospital, what do? We have a system of where we really look to do reasonable adjustments for the person and design things in a universal way that fits the needs of everybody. I might move on to the next slide, please. So differences in social interaction and communication. It's important, I suppose, in the past, children and young people who maybe would have difficulty with eye contact would have been encouraged to use eye contact. We don't do that anymore. We know that from the autistic perspective, eye contact can be very difficult, or a person isn't able to focus and concentrate if they are given eye contact. So again, we're looking now, instead of trying to fit the person into what we think is neurotypical or what they should be doing, is more to see the perspective of the autistic person, and that the neurotypical person might change their interaction to meet the other person halfway. And social interaction in the neurotypical world is often very stressful for the autistic person. Things you might see are echolalia, immediate or delayed echolalia, where something might be repeated. And this communication can sometimes be actually meaningful. And often people think there's no meaning to that, but there actually can be. And the nuance of neurotypical body language and gesture can be hard for the autistic person to decode. I might move on, please, to the next slide. So in the diagnostic criteria, we have restricted and repetitive activities and interests. And really that needs to be reframed now, and we need to look at that as a strength. So the special interests and self-regulation. So this is where a person may have a really, really deep interest in something. And this is actually a huge strength of the autistic brain. So if we look at the theory of monotropism, which I won't go into too much because we don't have time, but there's a link there if anyone would like to read more about it. It really looks at, it's a theory that autism is based on the brain as a system of attention and interest, and that autistic people have a monotropic mind, so therefore that they just are able to channel all their energy and attention through one channel at a time. But that is a very deep channel that has you know, can see a lot more detail than what the neurotypical polytropic brain can do. So this is sort of explaining the way lots of autistic people, if they're very interested in one subject, will be able to see a lot more detail and have a lot more knowledge on that subject than what a neurotypical person could have. Again, with repetitive routines and activities, really what we see that now is a huge protective factor for the autistic person. So that's where somebody might use stimming behaviors like repetitive actions like jumping up and down or flapping or walking up and down or bouncing, or maybe repeating the same phrases over and over again. This is something that helps the autistic person to be regulated, to feel okay in the world, and to feel safe in a world that is very, very alien to them at times. So again, in the past, people were often tried, you know, families try, teachers, people well-meaningly tried to stop the person doing those behaviors so that they would actually stand out less. But now what we want is for the person to feel free to do whatever that they need to do to keep themselves regulated. But very often, if you try and stop somebody from regulating themselves, what happens is you have an emotional or a physical response. So again, in hospital, what we can do is try and facilitate the person to be able to do their usual stimming behavior, if at all possible. It's not always easy in the environment of the hospital. I might move on to the next slide, please. I think the next slide is about senses. So when we look at sensory differences for autistic people, people can have differences in any of their senses. And I know, am I coming short in time, Catherine?
Just have 4 minutes now, Orla.
Okay, I'll fly through the next few bits then. So this is quite important because people think that we have you know, people, when you ask them to name the senses, they usually name the 5 senses from on the outside of the body. But there are 3 hidden senses within the inside of your body, which are the ones on the right-hand side there. So proprioception, interoception, actually vestibular is over here on the other side. So your balance, the input that you get from your muscles and your tendons and all of that in your body, helping you to know where you're sitting in your chair maybe, or where your body is in space. The really crucial one in the moment that's coming out in all the research is the interoception sense. So that is where we sense and interpret internal body states. And that could be hunger, it could be a full bladder, it could be sensations related to emotions. And this is where often autistic people have difficulty with emotional regulation, because maybe they haven't linked a physical sensation in their body to an emotion in a way that neurotypical people can just do seamlessly. I'll move on the slide, please, to the next one. There's a link down there at this slide, which is a link to a video about sensory overload, which you can have a look at. Very important to say, autism and intellectual disability are 2 completely separate things that you can have. Some people have both, but people with autism can have any level of intellectual functioning. So you can have anything from severe profound intellectual disability all the way up to very high, you know, very bright person. If a person has a dual diagnosis, then the needs of that person are going to be more consistent across their lifespan. I might move on to the next slide really quick and try and finish up really quickly. I might just amalgamate all the next few bits. You can get the whole presentation, and we'd skip that one, I think. It's just all the co-occurring things. I just wanted to say quickly about what you can do in hospital when you're caring for autistic people. There's some more interesting information there about all the new theories around autism, and I'll move on to the next slide. You can look at those afterwards yourself. They're very interesting. Well, I find them very interesting anyway. So in hospital, what do we need to do? Really, we need to change ourselves. We need to change, instead of asking the person to change who's coming in, or the child or young person, we need to change the system as much as we possibly can. So we need to look at reasonably adjusting how things are done, really looking at a low arousal environment, so less stimulation, you know, less light, less noise, less words. Even if a person has a lot of communication and they're able to communicate verbally, when they're stressed out, their ability to hear and understand words is going to be diminished. Use pictures instead of words, lower down lights, one voice only, and again, give the person opportunities to regulate, speak to the person themselves and family about what works for them, what are triggers for them. And I can't emphasize how important that is. And the parent, as you say, for the parent as the expert in that particular child, because what works for one person just works for that particular person. So really doing that individualized kind of assessment of the person and what they might need is so important. And being very conscious of mental health difficulties are absolutely massive and may present very differently for autistic children and young people, particularly if they have a co-occurring intellectual disability. And I would just say is really think about how you can regulate yourself in moments of distress. Keep yourself calm, keep the situations very safe as much as you possibly can, and give the person time and space. Reduce at all costs, try not to restrain if at all possible, although I know that that ends up being possible sometimes. And the final, I just put this final slide up just for people to think about where they're at in terms of their understanding of autism and neurodiversity. There's a little infographic at the end where it shows, you know, whatever level you're at. We just keep going to the very last slide. Yeah, I put in way too many slides. So that you might see where you're at, and then you can go onto that website and see how you can level up in terms of your understanding of autism and neurodiversity. Thanks so much for your attention.